As advertised before the coffee break, this is the session where we hone in on UK policy towards the Middle East. Interesting, the title is Policy Fit for Purpose, which sounds like a bit of a leading question for our esteemed panel this morning, who I will introduce very briefly, and then the rules of the game are they will speak on the record for 15 minutes. I won't be timing it too closely, but I will be coughing if it goes much after 15 minutes, and that will leave us hopefully plenty of time, given the nature of the audience and your presumed interest in this area, to actually wade in with questions, observations, and some kind of discussion at the end of it. So we are very honoured to have the Right Honourable Alistair Burt MP, who, as you are probably mostly aware, was Minister of State for the Middle East and also at the Department of International Development until March of this year. And I believe is on the record of saying you'd quite like your job back, but you're not required to comment on that today. Secret. A little disguised, yes, not well kept secret. So he has, as we know, having served previous to that, I believe, as well from on the Middle East, a long experience, and can talk to us about policy as it was under his guidance and policy in the future. Dr. Toby Green is BICOM's former Director of Research and is also now a Research Fellow at the Leonard Davis Institute for International Relations at the Hebrew University, and he's been awarded a one-year fellowship, so he's amongst us at Queen Mary University in London. Now, Toby, I believe you wrote a book on the Tony Blair and Labour Party policy towards Palestine, so it would be interesting if you could observe how that has changed since the 1990s, or at least 2000s. And then last but not least is Dr. David Roberts, a lecturer at King's College London in the Defence Studies Department, which he joined in October 2013. But prior to that, he has direct regional experience, having been the director of the Qatar office of RUSI. And he is also an assistant professor, visiting assistant professor at Sciences Po in Paris. But presumably your research interest, David, is very much focused on Qatar's foreign policy and Gulf politics in general, so we look forward to hearing that. So the starting gun is fired. Over to you, Alistair, first.
Claire, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for providing a platform for someone who remains absolutely fascinated by the region and looks forward to working it in one way or another at some stage in the future. I thought what I'd do is, I've been asked to look at policy as it is now and where it might be going, and I thought I'd sort of 5 key questions over 3 minutes each, and just give a general flavour, and then the rest can be brought out by questions. Where are we now? Just to state the obvious. Supporting stability in the region is in all our interest, and we do it in a variety of ways. And I think the foundations of the United Kingdom's relations in the Middle East and policy in the Middle East is pretty firm and long-lasting for reasons that you'll be aware of. Firstly, on a personal basis, I can't overestimate to you the degree of feeling in the area towards the United Kingdom and the United Kingdom government and its representatives. It's not a glib phrase when people say, you know us better than anyone else. We sort of do. And there is a humbling respect for that, which makes a marked impression on a minister who is by nature a here today, gone tomorrow individual, but who represents a continuing presence. I've spoken before of going through the Qatari archives with Sheikh Mosa, which were being digitalised at the British Library, and seeing the names of the individual British agents and consuls at the time, dealing with the families who are still there now, and running affairs in Qatar and the Gulf, and recognising the deep personal relationships that there have been. So what we read about in textbooks and what we pick up in briefings are part of oral history for many of the people that we deal with. And that sense of relationship, I think, is very, very fundamental and not easily shaken by events. How demonstrated? Trade, for obvious reasons. Gulf, the fourth biggest non-EU export market. We're still the largest foreign direct investor in places like Egypt, with its biggest population in the Arab world. Significant investment comes here from sovereign funds and the like. So the economic and trade relationships are obviously fundamental and still there. Soft power and diplomacy. We're still on the UN Security Council. We're the pen holder on Yemen, for example. So many things that involve the Middle East, we're still engaged, and we exercise that role through diplomatic means. I think the UN Security Council remains a fulcrum for debate. We have the threat and the challenge to multinational institutions that I'm sure we'll touch on later. But for now, that remains, as I say, a fulcrum of debate and decision-making, and we're still very heavily involved. We have the other elements of soft power. We have the BBC, we have the British Council, we have the language, and combine that with the history and knowledge of the region, very firm foundations. There's the defence and security arrangements that we all know all too well, existing alliances. The new facility opened in Bahrain last year, the fact that we conduct exercises like Safe Syria in Oman, that tests out the army and the defence relationships. They're all key. The training that's provided in the region, the arms relationship is well known. We're also a defender of international rules. The work that's been done on chemical weapons after the usage in Syria, where the United Kingdom stimulated action amongst other nations to say this is a bridge too far and we are going to hold to the rules here and encourage others to do so. So in the region we are seen as a defender of the international order. And then finally, in terms of where we are now, there's the DFID element, and this is significant. It's DFID that helps pick up the consequences of conflict. The refugees being sheltered in Lebanon and Jordan, where the United Kingdom's DFID spend is working not only to keep people fed, but also to make sure they have education and the skills that they need. And in Yemen, again, significant support for those who've been damaged by the conflict, at one and the same time as trying to deal with the resolution of the conflict through other means. There is the reconstruction work being done in Iraq. So in all these areas we are already present, and I think this policy works pretty well, and I think there's very firm foundations. So what will challenge these policies in the future? Firstly, I return to a familiar subject, the echoes of the Arab Spring. I don't think the Arab Spring has gone away, because I think the fundamental drivers of it are still there in the region, in no particular order. It's population growth, for one. I mean, look at the populations of the region, then look at the doubling time, how long it takes a population to double. Egypt, with its 97 million people, 31 years for the population to double. Yemen, with its young population, 24 years for it to double. And you can go through the list and see the same. Population drives expectation of jobs and education not being fulfilled in many parts of the region. Governance issues remain in places to be resolved. Some of these issues are worldwide, from Venezuela to Hong Kong to Sudan, are not purely Middle East and North Africa, but the recent protests in Algeria, after a few years' delay from 2011, remind us all that things are still going on. Why the delay, we know very well. Algeria, with its memories of the horrors of its dark decade, the people were not going to be easily stirred in 2011, but a few years have gone on. People have learned some lessons. But our policy will be tested again as states deal with the consequences of Arab Spring, what I call the echoes of Arab Spring. There is the knowledge, the speed with which information flows now, which is going to continue to be a driver for change. We're going to be tested again on what is stability. Is stability the support for existing governments and regimes, and understanding a tolerance of what it is they're putting up with, on the basis that experience is telling us that almost any change could lead to serious disruption look at Libya, look at Syria, look at Yemen, and therefore is stability seen in supporting regimes that are under pressure, or is that support a fundamental driver of further instability? We're going to be tested out. I've been reading, as I'm sure many people here will have been, Bill Burns' excellent memoirs, The Back Channel. I was relieved to see from someone I regard as a very, very fine man and diplomat, that when I read the passage of Arab Spring, which of course is what I flicked to first in their memoirs, that they were just as uncertain as we were about how it was all being handled. And they admit to errors and mistakes in the short term, not realising what some of the impact of short-term actions would be in the longer term. And I think that tells us of the complexity of trying to deal with this and the complexity of trying to make decisions about what would lead to greater stability and what would not. Secondly, in terms of things that will challenge our policy position, are obviously the regional uncertainties on a big canvas, starting with the United States. And the combination of the policies of President Obama and now President Trump. The apparent pulling back of the United States from the region during the time has created many uncertainties and opened many doors. Syria, for example. In the United Kingdom, we had our own brush with this in August 2013. What to do with what was happening in Syria? My understanding of the Syrian narrative, I think, is very straightforward. It was a peaceful protest begun by people. The regime had learnt many lessons from what had happened in other places, was determined not to fall victim as others had, and a carefully constructed policy and narrative which saw the regime defending itself against terror, which wasn't the situation at first but became so, created a situation which we are still, of course, trying to deal with 8 years on. Should things have been done earlier to prevent what had happened? That uncertainty by the United States and ourselves in setting out red lines and then not following through opened doors in the region, opened doors for Russia, opened doors for Iran. The consequences of that have yet to be filtered through and fully understood throughout the region. The United States determination to push through MISA, Middle East Security Alliance, and the reluctance of some in the region to accept this. Is this a defensive alliance for the Gulf and Arab states, or is it an offensive alliance against Iran, which they want no part of? That uncertainty lingers. Where will the United Kingdom fall in relation to this? There is the GCC dispute itself, which has created new uncertainty. When I was first in post between 2010 and 2013, the GCC was one example in the region of something that had held together in difficult times, but it was a structure on which we could all work. Now, of course, it's under some serious pressure because the issue is not yet resolved. The United Kingdom remains a friend of all the states in the Gulf, and we're very determined to remain so. But we know that if not resolved, the pressures will come in time. Whose side are you on? The region needs sides like a hole in the head. It doesn't need this. The GCC needs to come together, and we need to continue to work to support efforts to do that. And then inevitably, there is China beginning to take an interest in the region for a long time, not very much, but in 2014, 2013, I understand, a designation of the Middle East as a neighbour state. And in terms of the circles of interest that China has, becoming a neighbour state was an important announcement of a renewed interest, which will not just be economic, but will be military and security as well. So the movement away of the United States and the hesitation about its role in the region, and by implication our role, then that's led to more uncertainty. Thirdly, how conflicts are handled has posed new challenges and opened up things. Firstly, nobody wins wars in the region anymore. I've given up on the idea of winning any war in the Middle East. very few issues are resolved by it. Something is buried and it appears again in the future. Syria is a demonstration of that, of something that's now lasted much longer than the Second World War, and the long-standing repercussions of the failure to deal with this. Things have moved on very rapidly. Oman in the 1970s, the assistance of the United Kingdom to secure the throne from His Majesty the Sultan, which has lasted well. Those days have gone. Free in Kuwait, everything is more complex now. I would counsel anyone with military ambitions in the region, just read and learn from your history. Is ISIS an exception? In one way it is. This was extraterritorial in a sense, where this evil ideology captured territory and has indeed been pushed back. But is the war over? No, of course it's not, because the ideology needs defeated as well. So my point is, nobody wins wars in the region anymore, and how conflicts have been handled have exposed and created new issues and put new pressures on us. Who's gained from the wars in Iraq and Syria and Yemen? Iran. Without doing very much, Iran has seen things fall into its lap, and it's taken advantage of it, as it is bound to do. It's an opportunist state, and it seeks to defend itself by its forward advances, and we can talk about that further. And as a further example of things coming back to bite us, we have the foreign fighters. What do we do with the foreign fighters? What do we do with the children of foreign fighters? So this is not over. We haven't got answers to these issues and the migration issues that flow further from it. There is an opportunity with modern conflicts, and that is cyber and intelligence. And there the United Kingdom will have a role. We're good at this. And with good partners, we can play a new role in defending and supporting those in the region who are under attack. And I think this will gain in interest over time. Two further things in terms of conflict. How long-standing issues are handled or not. The GCC dispute I've mentioned, the long-standing issues between Saudi Arabia and Iran, for reasons, again, this audience will understand very well. And I've got to mention Middle East peace process. I have this deep despair that long-standing issues don't get managed, they don't get buried, they reappear. Because I'm a politician and not an academic and not a diplomat, I can say this. I've got a heart for this. I know it's an American type phrase, but I've been interested in the Middle East peace process since I was at school, as a child during the Six-Day War when I was 12, with lots of Jewish friends in North Manchester, understood a bit about it, and then as I got older, understanding the Palestinian issue much more deeply. And being involved in the foreign affairs the last few years, realising you've got to see every issue from each other's point of view. And I don't believe MEP can be kept on a shelf somewhere, unresolved. If it's not settled, and if it's not settled both justly for the Palestinians and also with security for Israel, something bad is going to happen. And therefore, the failure to handle long-standing disputes, that creates another degree of uncertainty and will again challenge the UK's role. What will the UK's role be? The United States has changed its role in relation to MEP. Who steps in? And I can see a role for us there. Finally, let me turn to one further thing that will disturb British role, and that is something called Brexit, you may have heard of. Again, I mean, I know this is being recorded, but none of my colleagues will be surprised at my remarks. I'm heartbroken about Brexit. I'm not a Brexiteer. I accept the democratic verdict that we've been given, and I've been working with other colleagues to see that through. But don't overpress me on this. I think I'm deeply, deeply worried about the implications of Brexit and leaving our friends and partners at a crucial time for them. I wish the referendum result had been different, but it wasn't. So we now have to deal with the consequences. I've rarely come across a more lose-lose situation. In diplomatic terms, and the politics and diplomacy of Brexit were not really spelt out during the campaign. But Europe loses. The EU loses. The diplomatic reach of the United Kingdom, which has been extensive, the close security and defence cooperation, will have to invent new ways to deal with the relationships that were secured through council meetings and the like and the normal bilaterals. It's not that it's impossible to do. We've just made it more difficult. For ourselves, we lose the clout of 28. I didn't wear a little pin badge when I was abroad, but I felt when I was going into meetings, I was representing the 28 as well as representing the United Kingdom. The first numbers on my speed dial were Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne in Paris and Niels Annan in Berlin. And I felt I was working as part of a team. We're going to lose that. We're going to lose that sense of commonality in dealing with some of the issues that are new, climate change, migration, that we're going to have to deal with. And we're going to lose out on that. I think we will build something new. The relationships with France and Germany will be vital. And I think two further things, if I might just mention finally, just to wrap up, we have to consider in terms of the new future. The first is we've got to invest more. We've got to invest in the Foreign Office much more than we've done up to now. We need more personnel. We need more languages. We're not bad at Arabic, but we could, I'm sure, be better. And I speak no languages at all, so I'm no one to talk. But we've got to make sure we've invested further in the Foreign Office and that. And the second issue is a tough one, because we're going to be more on our own and make some more individual decisions. It's right that we talk about boosting our defence commitment and maybe increasing the amount we spend on it, but that's not the issue. The issue is deployment of defence forces. And I'm not sure that the United Kingdom has yet come to a serious conclusion about when it is going to use its forces and when it isn't. I think we'd defend Gibraltar, and I think we'd defend the Falklands, but I'm not sure what else Parliament would do. I'm very against Parliament having an executive say-so. I think it's for governments to deploy forces and answer to Parliament afterwards and explain what it's doing. But I think the decision for the United Kingdom is, when are we going to deploy forces? We decided not to do so in relation to Syria, and that went well. No one knows what would have happened if we had done something, but we do know what happened as we didn't. We're going to face more and more of those challenges. And I think we've not yet come to decisions in Parliament and in government about how we use our forces. And I think that's what we have to do. Finally, wise words from the House of Lords report in the Middle East, the New Realism, a very good piece of work it published in 2017, when one of its conclusions was, the United Kingdom does not have the luxury, as the United States does, of reducing its exposure to or engagement with this neighbouring region. Absolutely not. The Middle East is a part of us, and the challenges that are there and our role there, I think, is firmly rooted in history, but there are a series of reasons why we're going to have to think through new approaches in the years to come, and I hope I've given you some insight into what I think about some of them. Thank you very much.
Okay, over to Toby.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you very much to RUSI and to BICOM for giving me the opportunity to participate in this very valuable event. And I also want to take this opportunity to say a particular personal thank you to my colleagues at BICOM, because this is actually, in effect, my last day as a member of the BICOM team after more than 11 years working in the organisation, and it's been a very great pleasure, and I just want to thank my BICOM colleagues for making it such a stimulating and engaging and enjoyable place to work. So thank you to my colleagues at BICOM. Looking at the region from here in the UK, it can seem somewhat distant perhaps and removed from the day-to-day life of people here. For those of us that live in the region, and I live in Israel, I've lived in Israel for the last 13 years, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit more obvious how the tensions and challenges facing the region impact on the day-to-day lives of people across the region. And I can illustrate that with a sort of personal example. So I live in a town in central Israel called Modi'in. It's halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And there's a hill about a mile from my apartment building where they have a base there, an emplacement for an Iron Dome missile defense battery. This is the Israeli system which intercepts short-range rockets that get fired out from the Gaza Strip on a fairly regular basis. But the actual missile battery itself isn't there all the time. It kind of comes and goes. There's only a finite number of missile batteries available, and the IDF moves them around depending on where it thinks the threats and the needs might be. But you can actually see from the road in plain sight whether the missile battery is there or not. So when it shows up, it kind of puts us on notice that maybe the IDF thinks there's an increased possibility of missiles being fired at the center of the country, and we're quite close to the airport. So I can tell you that about a week and a half ago, in the context of all these tensions in the Gulf between the US and its allies and Iran, what do you know, the Iron Dome battery showed up on the hill a mile from my house. And I can't draw a direct link between these two things, but it's not, it's not crazy to me that what's happening in the Gulf several hundred miles away will have factored into the IDS calculation of whether missiles might be fired at the center of Israel, very close to where I live. Now, so it's clear to me that when tensions rise in the region, I live in Israel, but they rise for all of us, Israelis, Arabs, Iranians, and when there is calm and prosperity in the region, there's calm and prosperity for all of us. But my main message here today for this audience is that whilst it's very obvious to me how the tensions and the challenges in the region affect my life and security for me and my family, I think it's very important for people in the UK to understand how directly what's happening in the region is significant for people living here in the UK and for Britain as well. I was asked about a year ago to work on this BICOM paper, British Middle East Strategy after Brexit. And what we tried to do in this paper is we highlighted the changes shaping the context of British foreign policy, many of which we've already heard about today. Brexit, of course, the trend towards retrenchment on the part of the United States, increasing multipolarity, Russia, China. But we also looked at long-term trends in the region in the light of British economic and security interest. And that was an opportunity to do what I think it's often difficult for politicians and officials in the trenches, so to speak, to do, and that is look beyond the current crisis, to look long-term beyond the horizon at some of the long-term changes. And we've heard mention of a few of them already here today, but hopefully I can add a little bit extra data on some of the things we've heard. Firstly, in terms of economic interest, if we just start with energy and energy security, British oil and gas import dependency is projected to rise from 38% in 2018 to 69% in 2035. And already today, a third of UK gas imports are liquefied natural gas from Qatar. Now, whilst this is, of course, another good reason to reduce dependency on fossil fuels, that is not going to happen overnight. At the same time, the UK exports currently more goods and services to the Arab world than it does to India and China combined. And the region is of course, likely to grow as a source of inward investment into the UK and as an investment opportunity for British industry and business as Middle East economies try to diversify. And of course, the relative importance of that Middle East trade only increases in the context of Brexit. But as the significance of the region for the UK economy grows, the drivers of instability in the region and the security threats potentially emanating from the region are not going away. In fact, the danger is that they are multiplying. We've heard a bit about demographics, and Alistair mentioned that. Just to put some figures on that, the Middle East population is expected to grow from 570 million today to 840 million by 2050. Europe's population, by the way, is expected to decline over the same period. And we've heard this question mark over what percentage of the region is under 24. Anything up to half the region's population is under 24, with very high youth unemployment. But as populations are soaring, they are also aging, which means the problems that we have even today of very large youth population and unemployment issues will be matched in the future by growing elderly populations in Middle East states. So the burden on states is going to grow, as will the burden on natural resources. Water is an obvious example. And as populations grow, oil-rich states need to transform their socioeconomic models to cope. We see this particularly in Saudi Arabia, of course. Those states need to create employment. They need to cut subsidies. They need to introduce taxation. And that's much harder in the Arab world because of all the ways in which Arab development is lagging behind other parts of the world. And just one statistic which really illustrates one key aspect of that, if you look at female participation in the workforce in Arab states, you typically see somewhere in the range of 10 to 30%. So to make the kinds of socioeconomic changes necessary, it's also going to require social liberalization, and it's also likely to increase public demand on governments to be more responsive. All of those factors have the potential to undermine existing social and political orders. At the same time, we see increasing religious and cultural diversity, which is diluting traditional sources of authority, both political and religious. And as we've seen also in the West, increased use of social media also leads to increased social fragmentation. And we've already seen, of course, how powerful social media is in the hands of extremists. Today, 63% of Arab youth obtain their news from social media, compared to just 51% from television and just 18% from newspapers. So in short, the drivers which have helped bring about the so-called Arab Spring and the direct consequences for Europe, including for Britain, in terms of Islamist extremist terrorism and uncontrolled waves of migration, those challenges are not going away. If anything, they are multiplying. And if all that was not enough, we face the prospect of a nuclear arms race in the region. Even under the terms of the JCPOA, by 2031, Iran would be allowed to enrich as much uranium as it likes and stockpile as much enriched uranium as it likes, and enrich to as high a level as it likes. And we already know from the secret nuclear archive recovered by Israeli intelligence last year that Iran has a fully completed design for a nuclear warhead. We also know that Saudi Arabia has said publicly, whatever capabilities Iran has, we will match them. So the potential for a nuclear arms race in the region over the next 10 to 20 years is very, very real. Now, all of these factors are long-term drivers of instability, but some of them can also be viewed as opportunities. Growing populations can fuel economic growth if you can create adequate economic and employment opportunities. And of course, it creates opportunities for UK industry as those economies in the region seek to diversify. Even climate change can potentially create opportunities in the sense that some regions are projected to get increased rainfall, which could create some opportunities if they can be harnessed. Given the scale of these challenges and opportunities, it seems obvious that the UK should continue to view active engagement in the region as absolutely vital. Now, that clearly requires a financial commitment, as Alistair said, to all of the arms of UK foreign policy, diplomacy, development, and military capability. But I think it also requires something else, which is a commitment on the part of political leaders to make the case domestically for a long-term commitment to Britain's global role and a reaffirmation of what that role is. What we see in the UK and across the West currently is new forms of political contestation. We see rising radical political forces on the right and the left which challenge the traditional consensus about foreign policy. So the radical left, and this relates, I guess, to the themes of my book, which Claire mentioned, views the West as the greatest source of injustice in the world and instinctively aligns with any actor which is challenging the United States and its allies, and that includes radical Islamists and it includes Iran. Meanwhile, the radical right increasingly defines Western identity not in terms of universal human rights or liberal values, but in terms of what you often hear referred to as a Judeo-Christian civilization, which is defined in opposition to non-white cultures and especially in opposition to Islam. Both these forms of populism, right and left, tend to be skeptical about investing in global governance and in foreign intervention. But meanwhile, while you've got these new forms of political contestation undermining the former consensus about the national interest, which we've heard very eloquently described by Alistair, previously by Sir Mark in the last panel, so whilst that consensus is being challenged by rising radical left and radical right ideologies and parties, we also see changes in the nature of political communication. Social media, obviously, has changed, I think, I'd be interested to hear Alistair's views on this, changed the very nature of foreign policy decision-making. Political leaders face greater pressure to react to events in real time and to respond in ways that satisfy the most vocal elements of their own core constituency, their own base, rather than thinking long-term about the interests of the state as a whole. So I would suggest that politicians that care about the long-term interests of the country, and I think I could certainly put Alistair in this category, need to resist these kinds of pressures, to polarize issues on questions of foreign policy, and above all, resist the temptation to try and cut Britain off from these global challenges and responsibilities. And that reminds me a little bit, again, of that Iron Dome battery that sits on the hill a mile from my home in Modi'in. The problem with the Iron Dome, and believe me, I'm very happy the Iron Dome battery is there and it works very effectively, but the problem with the Iron Dome is it can tempt policymakers into thinking that they can cut themselves off from the problems in the region and just kind of put up barriers, rather than trying to get out there and actively engage in trying to resolve issues, rather just put up barriers that can cut the country off from those issues and defend from those issues rather than trying to resolve them, deal with them. I think that's a troubling temptation for policymakers in Israel, but I think you have a parallel temptation for policymakers here in Britain as well, a temptation to just try to imagine that Britain can be sort of insulated or cut off from these global challenges, and that Britain does not have a responsibility or a necessity to go out there and try and address them. That, I think, is a mistake that needs to be avoided. In conclusion, the Middle East's challenges will continue to impact directly on the UK. In fact, I think that they will increasingly impact on the UK, and therefore, Britain needs to continue investing in the tools to help influence and shape the future of the region.
Thank you. Okay, our third and final speaker, David.
So, thank you very much. Thanks to Mike and everyone at RUSI for the opportunity to chat about the Gulf. I never turn it down whenever I get the chance. So I teach at the UK Defence Academy, and my students, I'm sure that they're not alone, they've always got this phrase about stealing sandwiches. When they go second or third in a panel of speaking, they inevitably complain that the people before have stolen their sandwiches and they don't have as much to say. I have had a few sandwiches stolen, let me be clear. While I have innumerable Gulf lectures in mind that I could switch on to, what I might do is take a couple of minutes out of my chat, a bit more time for Q&A, but let me crack on. So I want to say 4 things, some things echoing what we've heard, some things offering a counterpoint and drawing them together. I want to say that, number 1, we in the UK, we are special and unique in some ways, as I will describe, as we've heard. But number 2, we need to be careful about that sentiment. We are not necessarily as special as we think. We can't rely on that, is my second point. Thirdly, I want to come on to talk about a fundamental tension and difficulty that we have, I think, in the UK. Everyone has it to a greater or lesser degree. And that's the same kind of dilemma that our security services face, in the sense that their successes are not really known and their failures are demonstrably public. That's a bit of a paradox, I think, in our Gulf policy that's a very difficult square to circle, or circle to square, whichever you prefer. And coming on, perhaps I'll spend quite a few minutes talking about the future, in the sense that this whole Brexit debate and all that, it's coming at a bad time in the Gulf when there is truly an unusual confluence of events going on. We have this rising Gulf phenomenon that we are plugging into and trying to engage with. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that, but the timing is not good. So those are my 4 kind of points. So we are sort of special and sort of unique in some ways. Royal diplomacy is a thing. It might sound very anachronistic, it might sound quaint, it might be all of those things, but there is something unusual there. A royal visit can do certain things that other visits cannot do. It is about the amount of contact time with elites. We might take for granted the fact that it is relatively, with a capital R, relatively easy for senior British ministers to get face time with important elites in the region, but that's an unusual feature, and that is one of the things that we shouldn't forget is in our HMG, in our sort of governmental arsenal, if you will. The sovereign decision, based on some of those issues, the sovereign decision, the decision by the elite, by the emir or whatever the title may be, can be crucial. They can intervene. Perhaps some of the core British policies in British defence sales, at least in recent months and years, have come about, broadly speaking, by sovereign decision, as opposed to by the machinations of government and bureaucracies, pulling things together, working out which bit of kit is better. The sovereign decision in a variety of ways can be really quite important. A bit more kind of pragmatically, we shouldn't forget our military role in the Gulf. It is pretty unusual. It is pretty significant, as we kind of know. Britain has nearly the majority, a surprising amount of the mine-sweeping capability in the Gulf, which is a bit bizarre, but such is life. This is a factor of our relationships out there, that we have these niche capabilities that are very important, are very well regarded. How we can use that and leverage that is a very different question. It's not entirely clear to me how we can do that. But that is another factor of our our difference in the region. And then the wider kind of the soft power thing that we've heard a bit today. London, people, a lot of our friends in the Gulf elites live in London, they're educated in London, they like to come here, they like to spend their money here and their state money here. We all know that, and that does play a role. So we are, in many ways, that we shouldn't forget, fairly well set up in that sense. Having said that, we shouldn't rest on our laurels by any stretch of any imagination. The day-to-day business of your average businessman in the Gulf is not British businessman in the Gulf, or woman for that matter, is not particularly easy. The fact that you have a British passport cuts, as a general rule, extraordinarily little ice. And of course, why would it or why should it? Market dynamics rule above all else. We are in a pitched battle with dozens of other countries offering similar bits of kit or similar equipment or similar services. A British education comes into play here, and that familiarity piece, yes, those are all factors. But the fundamental kind of structures and incentives of the people making those decisions way below the sovereign level, their incentives, their how they operate, I mean, they don't take into account HMG links as a general rule. Certainly the sovereign can sort of reach down and make a decision, and that has happened on numerous occasions, but we need to not overburden ourselves with expectations of how easy our life could or should be. And this is not just an issue for small and medium-sized businesses, for that matter. Some of the largest British businesses very much struggle in the Gulf because it's a difficult market. Of course it's a difficult market. There aren't any easy ones. The point being, of course, that the British emblem on the flag or whatever on the business card doesn't help as much as we might expect. And in terms of these sovereign prerogatives, we have seen, as I'll come on to talk about in a minute or two as well, quite a few examples in recent months and years, to be honest, of a change. This is part of this rising Gulf idea. The UAE, for example, forcing effectively the British government to conduct a report into the Muslim Brotherhood in the UK, if we wanted any cookies, is quite significant, I think. And we've seen a few other examples along those lines of very pointed decisions and policies and actions by Gulf states that they're not unreasonable in themselves, and I'm not making a normative case against them. But again, my point is, if we conceive of ourselves as having this unusual role, we mustn't forget that that is maybe shifting to some kind of degree. And moving on to perhaps something of a core problem. A lot of the British government's ideas, rhetoric, if you will, and indeed the House of Commons report that Alistair highlighted, it's a very good read. It's a couple of years old, but it's still remarkably current. A new realism, time for a new realism, something like that. It talks about this. What is the payoff for this British private diplomacy? We hear that we have these significant links, and I think we do to a large degree, to certain elites. We have the ability to have the quiet word, such as it may be. We have those links to have those meetings, those semi-formal meetings. And informally, I'm sure we've all come across certain instances where that has been important in a particular instance or two. But in a strategic case, it is very hard to get that evidence. It's not out there, really. It's not open source evidence, of course. about that extra influence that we have. And this is the point about the security services. So when the failures or the lack of a British influence to exert control, the obvious example that we're all probably thinking of course, is with the war in Yemen. The British government's inability to reach out and stop the egregious nature of some of the actions that are going on there is a failure, is a transparent failure, and that is obvious and that is clear, and that is, that's in the press an awful lot, and there's been good investigative work done here. Those failures are obvious. The quiet successes that British diplomacy may or may not have accrued elsewhere, we simply do not really know in any kind of a substantive way. So, to come to a conclusion about weighing those issues up is extremely difficult. And that's a difficult kind of a paradox a difficult circle to square there, I feel. The last thing, looking towards the future, again, talking about the confluence of, don't need to belabor the British Brexit travails, but looking to the Gulf and this idea of the rising Gulf. We need to beware the sin of presentism, that we think that everything that is happening today is ipso facto the biggest and most exciting and biggest change. But in this case, I actually think it is, in the sense of the Gulf monarchies. I think there are empirical examples of the Gulf monarchies asserting themselves as never before. The war in Yemen is qualitatively and quantitatively new. The level of interaction of the Gulf monarchies, their aspirations, the size, the scale, this is entirely new. It's perhaps indicative of this Gulf rising, if you will. The fact that the UAE are now a fundamentally new actor in the Horn of Africa region, with all of their numerous new military bases, is again symbolic of this rising Gulf, if you will. It's been a long time since the Gulf monarchy has had a foreign kind of outpost. You've got to go back a long, long time, with Oman pretty much. The Brotherhood Report, I've already mentioned, not the most friendly piece of international diplomacy. We have various Gulf states operating as serious, very serious regional actors. Now, of course, the Gulf monarchies have long used dinar diplomacy to further their foreign policy, so we've got that, but we've got this really followed up by a new military element in Syria, and more noticeably these days in Libya, perhaps, which may or may not marry with British HMG interests. Great if it does. What can we do if it doesn't? That's the point there. And so all these kinds of decisions, I think, all these kinds of examples are symbolic of this rising Gulf, coming at a time when we are coming to the Gulf monarchies in the near future, with Brexit on our minds, evidently looking for modus vivendi in deals, and we are in a weak position, of course. Now, theoretically, and I say theoretically with a capital T, there is the potential for some kind of, I like the phrase from earlier on, iconic project. There is a scope in the Gulf for HMG to fashion some fundamentally new Gulf vision. Theoretically, there is. Going back to my first point, we have some kind of unusual role there. We kind of do. And if we can spin that in the right way, if we want to attempt to forge a fundamental link of meaningful long-term engagement, theoretically, that is open. We have many facets and services and skills that our friends in the Gulf need and want. So they are demanders to some degree, and we are able to supply. The fundamental difficulty in that, though, is again to build on an earlier panel that we are not quite French enough. We don't have the ability or the prerogative to have a stable long-term policy. Britain has to a certain degree, a reputation in the Gulf as being quite fickle. Your ministers of defence change every 6 months. Should I really get to know this one? Is there any point? Is a literal refrain I've heard, which comes truer and truer every few years. That kind of idea of and the fundamental nature of our parliamentary democracy, of course, making such an overture unlikely and not necessarily very believable. The Labour Party, I'm sure, is giving the concept of, from the Gulf perspective of the Labour Party coming to power, will not be thrilling many Gulf monarchies at the moment, I suspect, and that adds into that. But there's this space. The Gulf is changing. It has gone from the Portuguese Empire to some lesser degree to the Ottomans having a pretty important role. We had a very important role. The US has a pretty important role. But I think that we are past the apex of the US role in the Middle East, in the Gulf in particular. This is not to say that the Americans will be shipping out any time in the next couple of years. Absolutely not. But the next iteration will not be Britain. It certainly won't be Britain. And I don't think it will be China either. It will be indigenous reliance within very important niche relationships with Israel perhaps, or with South Korea, or with the UK. That's the kind of the area that we could be aiming for if we can overcome these fundamental flaws, as it were. So I'll leave it there.